chapters 23 and 24. Chapter 23, Blame It on the Cloud. Mrs. Jules went from desk to desk as she handed back their math tests. "I'm very disappointed in you, Joy," she said. "You need to learn your 6s and 7s. Joy had gotten an F. That awful letter was written in red ink, and there was a circle around it. "But it wasn't my fault, Mrs. Jules," Joy complained. "It's the cloud of doom. It made me change my answers." Said Mrs. Jules as she took another look at Joy's test. She made 2 little strokes with her red pen, changing the F to a B. Joy smiled. The door swung open and Bibi walked in more than 15 minutes late. "Bibi, you need to put your name on the board under discipline," Mrs. Jules told her. "Don't blame me," said Bibi. "I left my house on time. The cloud of doom slowed me down." "Oh, okay then," said Mrs. Jules. Leslie screamed. Mrs. Jules turned. "Paul pulled my pigtails," she accused, "both at the same time." "Paul, what do you have to say for yourself?" demanded Mrs. Jules. Paul shrugged. "Cloud of doom?" he tried. Leslie turned around and shook her fist at Paul. "I'll doom you, you ugly bug sniffer." "Leslie, that's no way to talk," said Mrs. Jules. "It wasn't me, Mrs. Jules," Leslie said sweetly. "The cloud of doom made me say it." "Well, apologize to Paul for calling him ugly." "But I didn't call him ugly," said Leslie. "He sniffs ugly bugs." Jenny and DJ laughed. Mrs. Jules glared at them. "Cloud of doom," they said at the same time. Mrs. Jules continued to hand back the tests. "You can do better, Terrence," she said. When she came to him, Terrence crumpled his test into a ball and brought it to the front of the room, where he dropped it in the trash. He stood there a moment, staring at the trash basket. "Terrence, return to your seat," ordered Mrs. Jules. He stayed there where he was. "Terrence, do you have a problem?" asked Mrs. Jules. "No," said Terrence, "no problem." He kicked the basket. It sailed end over end across the classroom, spilling trash along the way. Mac raised both his arms like a football ref. 3 points, he declared. "Terrence!" exclaimed Mrs. Jules. "Sorry, the cloud of doom made me do it," said Terrence. "Mac," said Mrs. Jules, "you know better." "Cloud of enough," shouted Mrs. Jules. "I get it. It's hard with that cloud hanging over us all the time. But you can't blame it for everything that goes wrong. You have to take responsibility, and that means working extra hard so things don't go wrong. So I'm doubling all of your homework." "That's not fair," complained Benjamin. Mrs. Jules told Benjamin to write his name on the blackboard under the word discipline. "The ultimate test will start on Monday," Mrs. Jules declared. "It will take about 3 days to complete, and you better be prepared, cloud or no cloud." There were lots of groans. Mrs. Jules returned to Joy's desk. She crossed out the B and this time gave her an F-. "Terrence, there's a broom in the back closet. I want you to pick up the trash basket and sweep the floor. Mac will help you. Everyone else, get in line behind Benjamin and write your names on the blackboard under discipline." There were more moans and groans as everybody rose from their seats. "Except you, Todd," ordered Mrs. Jules. "You're the only one who's been good." Todd sat back down. He scratched his head. "You used to be a nice teacher," said Rondi as she made her way to the blackboard. "Why are you so mean?" asked Allison. Mrs. Jules just shrugged and said, "Cloud of doom." Above them, the dark cloud continued to churn as it turned itself inside out again and again. No one hardly noticed it anymore, but it continued to grow larger and more powerful every day. Lightning flashed inside the cloud where no one could see it. Thunder boomed where no one could hear it. What happened in the cloud stayed in the cloud, for now. Chapter 24, Spelling Bee. The Ultimate Test, Day 1. The 4 unbreakables met by the flagpole before school. "Don't worry, Marisha," said Joy. "When you get sent back to kindergarten, I will still be your friend." "Thanks," said Marisha. "I know you'll do great. Nobody can jump rope like you can." "True," Joy agreed. "And Ron's memorized every page in the dictionary," said Dee Dee. Ron smiled. "Joy's a good speller, too," he pointed out. "You always get 100% on your spelling tests." "True," Joy agreed. "And one of Dee Dee's legs is shorter than the other," said Marisha. Dee Dee smiled. "Just lucky, I guess," she admitted. They locked thumbs and pinkies and shouted, "Unbreakable!" Marisha glanced up at the cloud of doom, then followed her friends into the school building. "I hope everyone's ready," Mrs. Jules greeted her class. "You just need to remember Everything you've ever learned in your whole life. The children looked nervously around. The test would last 3 days. Each day would have several minor tests and one major event. On day 1, the major event was a spelling bee. "You mean we have to spell the word out loud?" asked Joy. "That's how a spelling bee works," said Mrs. Jules. Joy did a lot better when she could write the word. She was a master of fudge squiggles. If she didn't know the letter, she made a fudge squiggle that could have been any number of letters. Mrs. Jules always gave her the benefit of the doubt. All the children stood along the wall as they waited for their turns. If they missed a word, they would have to sit down. Matt couldn't spell curious. Leslie missed squawked. Jason went out on confidential. "Dilly-dally," said Mrs. Jules. "Dilly-dally," Todd repeated. He got every letter right, but left out the hyphen. "It's not even a letter," he protested when Mrs. Jules told him to sit down. Jenny missed skateboard. Joy was next. "Helicopter," said Mrs. Jules. "Helicopter," Joy repeated. "H-E-L." She was stuck. She didn't know if there was 1 or 2 L's, and she didn't know if the letter after that was an E or an I. If she could have written it, she could have made the perfect fudge squiggles to cover all the possibilities. She returned to her seat. Dee Dee was eliminated on eliminated. A short leg didn't help with spelling. After a while, only 3 students remained: John, Ron, and Mauricia. "Spectacle," said Mrs. Jules. "Spectacle," John repeated. "Skeptical," S-K-E-P-T-I-C-A-L. Only Ron and Mauricia remained. "Orchestra," said Mrs. Jules. Murmurs could be heard around the room. Nobody thought Ron could do it. "Orchestra," Ron repeated, and then spelled it perfectly. "Vacuum," said Mrs. Jules. Mauricia wasn't sure if there were 2 C's and 1 U or 2 U's and 1 C, but she guessed right. Mrs. Jules closed her dictionary. "Well, that's all the dictionary words," she announced. "I guess I'll have to use words that aren't in the dictionary." It was Ron's turn. "Thrubbledub," said Mrs. Jules. Ron had memorized the entire dictionary. How was he supposed to spell undictionary words? "May I have the definition?" he asked. "It's when you count to 3 and fall asleep in the middle," said Mrs. Jules. "Oh, that's easy," Ron said, then correctly spelled the non-word. "Fudge squiggle," said Mrs. Jules. Mauricia spelled it perfectly. She even included the hyphen, having learned from Todd's earlier mistake. "Whump," said Mrs. Jules. Again, Ron asked for the definition. "It's the sound made by a jump rope as it brushes against the ground," explained Mrs. Jules. Ron gave his best shot. W-H-U-M-P-H. "I'm sorry, Ron," said Mrs. Jules. "There's 2 M's in whump." "I win!" Mauricia exclaimed. The class cheered. Ron felt cheated. If it's a made-up word, who gets to decide the number of M's? Mauricia's smile was big and bright. Ron was not smiling.